I'm excited to be talking with Rhonda Broussard today. She is an author, an entrepreneur, a futurist. She's also the founder and CEO of Beloved Community. She's been working in the nexus of equity, equity in schools, equity at work, and equity at home. And Beloved Community really brings this idea to light that when we create sustainable paths to equity, racial, economic equity, that we can create this beloved community. It's this quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that to create a beloved community that would require a qualitative change in our souls, as well as a qualitative change in our lives. So I'm thrilled, Rhonda, to be having you today. She's also the author of One Good Question, How Countries Prepare Youth to Lead. And she has a partner, Kim, and their bilingual family. They live in the Bulbanka land, and it's also known as New Orleans, where she teaches African dance. And I'm so thrilled that you're here, Rhonda. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm like listening to your introduction. I'm like, ooh, I want to talk to Rhonda. This sounds fascinating.
I want to talk to Rhonda. We all do.
It's the Aries in me. I'm like, oh yeah, she sounds like a great person.
We have to pat our backs. Like, how often can we do that, Rhonda, where we say, wow, we are badass? And let's recognize that. Like, let's love ourselves. So thank you for
Yeah.
saying that. I'm curious, Rhonda, have you always been that way where you're just like, I'm going to teach dance. I'm going to be at this nexus. I'm going to be this author. When you were young, thinking about your identity, how did that shape you?
That's a really good question. Certainly like what I thought I would be in the world has changed a lot. When I was very young, I thought I would be a teacher. And so to go into teaching in the classroom as my first career, my mother reminded me, she was like, this has been on your brain since you were little. I definitely thought I was going to be a lawyer at some point. And then we did some mock trials at school and I was like, they're lying. I don't like this. I don't want to hang out with people who lie on the stand. So that was out the window. I thought about journalism. I call myself often an armchair anthropologist. And so like this thread that carries throughout all of my work is this really deep belief in our shared humanity, right? And that like, how do we find the ways in which we are inextricably linked? And then my actual family, my family of origin, the adult family that I've created has impacted so much of my leadership journey. Like there are not, before I had kids, I definitely was not planning a career in leadership. I was a classroom teacher and thought I would be a teacher forever, maybe a building principal one day. And my children absolutely inspired me to start a network of schools that I ran for 8 years. The experience with I'm from Lafayette, which is a couple hours west of New Orleans, and we're the birthplace, the center of French-speaking Louisiana. And so growing up in that space, growing up with my grandparents, who all four of my grandparents grew up speaking French and Creole at home and learned to speak English in schools, it made this indelible mark on me around connecting to my family through language. So as a teenager, I decided I was going to be bilingual. I was going to hold on to our family's language. I would teach my kids our language, raise my kids in our language, and didn't think that was going to be any part of my vocation. And come to find out, it mattered to me a lot. And so being able to really lean in on this conversation and movement to have more Black and Brown young people in the States say, I'm proud to have 2 languages, I'm proud to have 3 languages, and not have to hide that anymore, really marked the first part of my career.
I mean, it is a myth, right, Rhonda, that there is one language. As someone
Correct.
who my parents didn't speak to me purposefully in Tagalog because they wanted me to learn English and to speak
Absolutely.
proper English, it's
Absolutely.
really inspirational to hear that you decided that you would learn, that you would teach your children, and that you would allow, even grow an organization, build and grow an organization where that is a beautiful thing, that there's this reach back to your ancestors through actual language. So can we talk about that, Rhonda? Because this concept of ancestors, did you, as a young child, or even as you think about your experiences with them, your ancestry through language, beyond language. How has that armchair anthropologist trying to find ties with humanity, have you found this like connection to ancestry to further you yourself and you as a leader trying to carry this work forward for others?
The place where I first found it was in joy, right? My grandparents raised me until I was 9, and my grandmother was my mother for all intents and purposes until she passed. And the thing that I hold most about her was what it looked like for her to be in joyful moments. And for her, it was almost always in our language, right? Like she spoke English, she worked at the school board, her English was fine. But if she was going to be on the phone to gossip, if it was Sunday morning coffee, if it was Friday night card games, right? That's the language of joy for her was different. And so I wanted to be in that. And I started this is a whole different part of my story, but I started dancing in my teens, like actually taking studying dance and preparing for dance performances. And when I started doing West African dance in Cameroon, and then I came back to the States to study, all of these older Black women who were in their 50s, my grandmother was in her 50s when she passed, who were in their 50s and who were teaching dance class became like these surrogate mother figures, right? Like that was my actual physical way to be in community with her, was to be in these dance companies and dance programs where I got to learn from. And the you know, when someone passes, you often hold on to that stage, right? Like they didn't advance past that stage. And so it kept recreating itself with women who are leading African dance communities across the country. And that was probably my first real grounding in that I can hold her, and it reaches back to all of these other ancestors. And then understanding what it means for people from any place in the world to be able to identify, like, here is a practice that keeps me grounded and connected. I got lucky that on my university campus, there was a Dunham class. I went to school in St. Louis. And so Catherine Dunham was from East St. Louis. There had lots of Dunham, not lots, but there were Dunham experts in the region who would come and teach classes. And I was like, what is this? I would hear the drums walking across campus and just like walk to the drums. Like, this is a class? I can get credit for this? Sign me up, please. Right. But then it just made space for me to understand that there are different languages that reconnect us. And for me, dance is the one.
Rhonda, hearing your story and knowing that you're a leader, you've been a leader of schools and leader of beloved community, I'm curious, how can you, and it's beautiful that you had access to dance as a young girl and then also as a college student and even as a dance instructor now, that you have this beautiful pathway of language and dance to stay connected and help your children stay connected. How do you encourage others to have that pathway when maybe it's not so clear, or maybe I didn't have the language? I'm curious, like, here's ways in which I would support others or I'd suggest to others to consider so that we can have this way of being present with it in our daily lives rather than a once in a blue moon or even never.
Before I talk about that, y'all, whoever is listening to this podcast, I don't want you to look out here and think, I'm going to go take a dance class with Rhonda Broussard. I'm not teaching dance right now. It is rare that I
took a dance class from Rhonda Broussard. Just to be clear, I was fortunate too. So I'm like, oh, you're a dance teacher. You're like, okay.
I love it. I love it. I love it. It is in my spirit. I'm like, this is what when I talk to my team about, like, what happens in retirement, what do I want to do in this next act? It is absolutely more dance instruction, more dance teaching, more dance, like learning through dance is a high priority. But yeah, the Google search will not help you. I'm going to help you with that right now. So what was the question, Annalisa?
I'm curious, how would you suggest others reach back to their ancestry so it's present in their daily lives, not having this beautiful childhood where it was already part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true for entrepreneurship. Like, if you're doing this activity, if I want to create something, I think it's true for for any artistic passion or inspiration, I think it's true for family connection. You have to find time to be quiet with your own self. And it's hard. It's hard to quiet your mind. It's hard to quiet your heart when you are always moving in service to other people.
Mm.
And anything that can help you do that and do it for a sustained period of time is going to make space for you to identify what that connection is for you. And so when I think about it on the entrepreneurship side, it's hard to develop a whole model for an organization or business when you're working on somebody else's mission. And you're dedicated to that mission. You need a little way to step, some way to step aside and clear your brain. And I think I said this to my kids when we were moving home in 2016. I was like, look, and my daughter, when she was little, would come to dance classes with me and tried her own dance classes. And I said, you don't have to do what I do, but you have to figure out what your thing is. You have to figure out what your arts connection is. You have to figure out what your relationship to this place is. Because they used to think of like, oh, you're from Louisiana. We're not from Louisiana. Mm. And when we came home, the dance company that I started working with, or that I selected to start working with, was high on my list because they had a youth company. And the youth company didn't dance. They did stilt dancing. And so I'm like, this is different enough. You're not doing what I do, but we get to be in community together, and you get to make your own relationship to this art form and to this city and this place. And I think that really matters.
I love the way in which you encourage your daughter to stay in connection to ancestors, but to do it in her own way. Like you don't have to do what mama's doing to be able to do this, and find your own path and do that through stillness instead of a blind, therefore you're doing, therefore I will do.
Right,
So
right.
I love
right.
that choice.
Now, I will tell you, when she got to, she started her undergrad this year. When she got to undergrad, and someone else on campus told her about some Afrofusion, Afrofuturist course that she could take, and she named it to me. I got excited on the inside. My heart was like, oh, my baby might be doing dance. But I will not tell her that. She's not listening to the podcast. I will not tell her that because I want her to find her own her own path.
You have to be a choice, right, Rhonda? The hammer is not usually a parenting technique that's effective.
It's so hard. It's so hard.
Rhonda, let's talk about you and your leadership role. And there's been so much backlash, as you know, against DEI and the politics, et cetera, critical race theory. Just how do we continue the work given the reality that our country is very divided, that there is sometimes ramifications like funding or support that's pulled from organizations and schools, young people. I'm curious, what's your view on this? And can you share anything that's going on that in your work that could help?
So my first view is, when I think about the attacks on critical race theory, on targeting LGBTQ students and teachers in schools, districts at the state and federal level, I go back to the fact that our ancestors had to do all of this education at home, right? For centuries, we didn't have any education about who we were as a people. We didn't have any role models in the official K-12 education system that showed you, here are adults who grew up queer and are leading lives in all these different ways, right? We had to learn that in community. So if we're thinking about having to learn to read under penalty of death, if we're thinking about it from having to learn about who our heroes were and what the civil rights movement was, even in the 80s, right? I grew up in the time period where Martin Luther King Day was not yet a federal holiday. And so my mother would organize at her job over like the lunch breaks. She would organize and set up tables for me and then my siblings, when they came along later, to come in and lead conversations and hold space for all of the workers around who Martin Luther King Jr. was, so that we could have our own opportunity to celebrate his life, to name the struggle, to look at what we were moving moving forward. And we didn't get that in school,
Mm.
right? We did the same thing around Black History Month. We would do the same thing for Juneteenth. And in this contemporary experience, we forget that our communities are the ones who have always provided that instruction for us. So go deeper into community. And I say this not just as an educator, I say it as a mother who's often giving people advice on, what kind of schools to look at for your kids. You're always going to have to supplement something in your children's education and their upbringing. School can't do it all. We don't want school to do it all. And so in this moment where this school trademark is under attack, we have to remember that we have deep community resources to continue this education at home. So that's one. Don't give up the education that our communities already know how to do. And then the second piece are like, here are all the things that we can be thinking about for those of us who are educators, or on the policy side or on the funding side, about the ways that policy protects practice, about the value of belongingness for young people and for our educators themselves. We need to be thinking about ways to build our training and support for elected and appointed school board members. That's the place where we're starting to see most of the fracture happen, in terms of policies that are being passed around text, around curriculum, around access to programming. That's where your biggest local impact is. So what's happening here for our elected and appointed school board members? How do we influence and hold accountable the ones who are there for what it means to really deeply value inclusion and equity within our schools? And for the bravest among us, how do we put our hats in the ring to say, I actually want to be a part of holding on to this for our community, in the face of small numbers of agitators who are having outsized impact? And I think there's also some space when we think about what opportunities funders have, so not only like the training and support for elected and appointed school board members, but thinking about this bigger pipeline of progressive candidates in local elections. How do you just prepare more people to think about their own lived experience and enter into there are all these series of progressive candidate preparation programs that folks could go to learn, right? Like one is literally just called Run for Something. And they're like, yep, we'll teach you how to run, and here's what matters to you, and here's how you can impact change at the local level. And I think it's if you're sitting in the district seat, like district level superintendent or even state level Department of Education, the questions about what we can do and what's going to come under attack, I think are where people are most afraid, right? Because people will fear that a lawsuit is coming, and out of that fear, not take action. And my perspective is, well, let's do it and get sued, right? And so how do you understand it from the district level? How do you understand it from the state level? How far can we push? And then either we get sued or we sue them. And I'm not a litigator, right? That's not my area of expertise at all. But this is what actual strategy looks like in this current iteration of a civil rights movement. Litigation was a tool, and a frequently used tool in the 60s when we think about things like desegregation. It's a tool that we have started using less and less, or we think is less available to us. We're like, oh, the ACLU does that. But the ACLU also needs named plaintiffs. So you need to be able to show up and say, here's how far we can push in our community. And we will be a named plaintiff for X suit so that we can continue this work. I think it requires a lot of bravery at different levels to push back right now.
Rhonda, when I hear your different strategies, first, let's start at home. Let's do our part in educating our children about the history, our ancestors. It's connected to, continuing the self-belief, but also this idea that there's, we don't depend on schools. We shouldn't depend on schools for all the things, that we can take charge there. And then expanding our locus of control to how can we support candidates with either training or even be a candidate ourselves, which when you said that, I was like, Oh my God, that sounds super scary. So we'll talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like litigation, which honestly, when I think about tools, that's not the first one to come to mind. You're just like, oh, right, we can do that too. As
Mm-hmm.
leads of organizations, we do have enough resources to make sure we can protect ourselves. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't even step up to the plate.
Right.
And so that's really powerful. I want to talk about risk and
Mm-hmm.
bravery because I'm not sure about you, but just as I was like, oh, of course, here litigation that's going to be handled by someone else. In my mind, honestly, too, the idea of putting myself out there is hard. Putting myself out there as a candidate is even just like I'm not even that's not even part of the possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot there. So I want to make sure I name it. And yet these times call for bravery. I'm curious,
Yeah.
what comes to mind for you about bravery in these times for you personally as a leader? I know that you've founded and lead beloved community, but what does that mean, right? Like bravery in the sense of, yeah, you need to run for something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. When you first started this conversation, I thought, am I brave? And am I doing the things that I'm espousing? And so I'm gonna sit with that for a little while. My son asked me when he was little, he's like, are you gonna be an activist when you grow up? And I appreciated his one generosity of thinking that I still had growing up to do. And two, that I could become an activist at whatever age. And so I still hold on to that with me. Alice Walker has a book called Hard Times Require Furious Dancing. And that is the place that grounds me, as we know from a dance perspective, but also naming that there is joy. We have always created moments of joy within the hard times, right? Within the context and the oppression and the genocides that our families have faced for centuries. I think there are levels. There's some people who know from a young age they want to be in public service and they want to be front-facing elected roles in public service. There are other folks who know, I want to be in public service, but I want to be the behind-the-scenes functionary who is doing the nitty-gritty work of policy change and influence and strategy. And some people don't figure out either of those things until they're inspired by some life event that's happening. What I think about when I'm naming this bravery, I think it's to know which of those folks you are first. And this goes back to some other conversations we're having about how well do I love myself and how well do I know who I am and how I'm showing up in the world. Once you can get clear about, are you trying to live that external facing life, or do you want to be doing more of the behind the scenes work? Then you can start to find, like, here's this pathway that demystifies all of that for me. And I think the bravery comes in being in proximity with people, organizations, ideas that help you demystify it. Which is why some of the organizations like Run for Something or Monson in Arizona are so helpful, because they're like, yeah, this is how it works. This is the whole process. Here's what you do. Here's what other people do. Here's how you build campaign structure and funding. And then there are organizations that once you get elected, help you figure out how to actually navigate the role of that particular elected official, like school board partners who works with elected school board members. And so it's just the idea that you don't have to do it all by yourself.
Mm.
You just have to figure out where you want to start.
Mm-hmm.
And once you can get clear about that, and I think this is true for everything, once you can clearly articulate, like, this is what matters for me. If you want to talk about it as manifesting, if you want to talk about it as prayer, if you want to talk about it as strategy, you have to be able to envision where you're headed, communicate it to yourself, and I think communicate it to at least one other person out loud or in print. And then the universe will help you identify the resources that are going to help you get there. And I think that's where the bravery comes. It's one step at a time. And then being able to have great counsel for people who have gone before you and done it the way that you want to see yourself lead, or people who've gone before you and who have had some missteps and can share their lessons learned so you don't fall down the same path.
Yeah, I hear you saying know yourself, make sure you're clear about what vision, right? What it is that you want to see in the world, and know yourself also enough to know where your strengths lie so that you
Mm-hmm.
can play the role, and that there are resources and people who can support
Yes.
us. That even though it will be scary, because I can't imagine that it's not going to be scary at some point, that you're not alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
And
so,
I would
go
add one
ahead.
more thing too, is to identify, particularly in this, with the speed of internet and um, public comment and public criticism on everything that you might do in the public eye, I would also name um, something that I think is unique for folks who are entering into that level of public activism and public engagement, that was maybe less true for folks in previous generations, is you've got to find what your support community is. You've got to find where you go for your own reset, how you block out um, all of the, not just block out, but release the toxicity that gets directed towards you. I think particularly about younger generations who do a lot of their activism online, and so are constantly bombarded with messages from people that they don't know, that are denigrating them, that are challenging them, that are threatening them, that are threatening to cause physical harm to them. And how do you know that all that exists and still make space to release, process, protect yourself, so that you can keep doing the work?
Self-love means self-care, and
Absolutely.
you don't have to do it by yourself. Find your people.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
since you lead beloved community, it's this beautiful, in my mind, like sort of in inner love, love of others, larger group of others, and as you said, that's how we make change. So
Mhm.
I love that so much. I'm curious, when you think, Rhonda, about change, especially given the context of the world today,
Mhm.
there's this change ourselves, love, and also this political public profile, which you can choose to step into, however you define bravery.
Mhm.
What are other ways in which, as a just organization in general, not necessarily schools, but just in organizations in general, as we think about how to keep DEI centered, right?
Mhm.
There's like the technical changes, right? You've got to have a DEI statement. Remember this? Like, okay, everyone's got a DEI
Yep.
statement.
It was
You
like a
just,
checklist.
yeah, a social media thing you put out there. You
Mhm.
hired maybe a DEI officer, usually a person of color. It's like boom, boom, and everyone's like, yeah, get on the bandwagon. And now
Yep.
people are, I don't even know if they're renewing those
And people
contracts.
people are firing their DEI
I
officers.
know, right? I mean,
You're
not
like,
even
oh, there were
renewing, they're
layoffs.
firing,
Yeah.
and so budgets, if they had any
Hmm.
budget, is just decimated. I'm curious, what are you seeing in terms of, okay, obviously it's history, right? We're not in one point in time, it's a long, we're part of a long, long history. And you are an armchair anthropologist. Um, and you said this earlier, like, how do we find ties of staying together? And we talked about love. I'm curious, where can we come back to in terms of, as an organization, in a practical way, if you're leading an organization, nonprofit, corporate, and you're trying to find historic practices or just even practices that we can implement today to find ways of not swinging back, right, the pendulum from one side to the other. I'm
Hmm.
curious what you would offer in terms of, people you've read, historic moments, or just even daily current practices that you could share with us.
The hard part for me is that the pendulum keeps swinging. And so the examples that we have are of the return, right? And that the moment that we're living in the States is not dissimilar to what is happening in Brazil or what's happening in Italy, or um, um, other countries where there's a more fascist or totalitarian expectation of governance. And then all the ways that our democracy is broken. And I actually like I don't have a hope right now for what that looks like. I mean, I think when we talk about it at Beloved and the what is on the other side of this, we typically hold up the work of abolishing apartheid in South Africa and what it took for them to get government level buy-in to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Committees, to do the work of truth and reconciliation, to do the work of reparations, and all the ways that their country still struggles today, right? That they're like the other side of this moment isn't a panacea. And so that they're the closest example that we name in that way, that like, here are the very specific things that made it possible for a deep commitment to humanity and a deep commitment for justice to prevail. It hasn't stopped systemic racism in their country. But it did make some very clear and has been clear and continuously protected guidelines for people. So for me, it feels like that becomes the almost the North Star of like, okay, in our lifetimes, maybe we can get to that. And still be ready to keep doing this work of beloved community on the other side. It's not going to go away. It's cold comfort, Annalisa. It's cold comfort, but yeah, that's where I am.
Thanks for that, Rhonda. It's not easy, right? And it is emotional to see the pendulum swinging, but know that even with history on our side, that, you know, things continue to swing back and forth globally. Even where do we find hope? And it's hard. So connected to that idea. And I'm wondering with this idea of dismantling the system, right? And also, what can I do in my vicinity of control at home? I said this, at home, at work, in my community. I'm just curious, when you say like, we need to do that kind of system work, right? And I'm just like, yeah, let's do it, you know? Where does that happen, right? Like, how do you, I mean, I know we have a case example, Mandela in South Africa, and that's all incredibly important and beautiful. I'm curious, when we think about our context in America, like, what would that look like? I know we're being the armchair anthropologist here, but like, where else could we do it, right? And you have just so much context as a teacher and in your work. So I'm curious, like, do you have thoughts on how that could be done in our own way? What could a gathering look like? Would it, you know, got to go get the people in the seats, run for something, and then we do it then? Like, how could this possibly look? And I know we're throwing, you know, on the paint on the wall, so it is okay to be messy. But I'm curious, what could that look like if you could have it your way?
Yeah. I like this kind of dreaming. So in the from the Thich Nhat Hanh perspective, right, the larger your beloved community, the more you can accomplish in the world. So in my way, it would be really thinking about all the different roles that people have to play, right? There are the roles for the agitators. There are roles for organizers. There are roles for folks who are more on the policy side. There are roles for people who are doing daily service and frontline facilitation with current power holders. There are roles for the people who do shadow work in terms of what they fund and don't fund in communities. And so we've been talking recently in this kind of informal space with other people of color who are either in nonprofits or in funding land. And we've talked about how where we get stuck is thinking that we all have to be moving towards the exact same end. And so the folks who are on the abolitionist side don't want to engage with folks who are DEI because they're like, that sounds transactional and we want something that's more radical. Or folks who are moving towards a liberation agenda get stuck because they're like, oh, you're talking about moving dollars and we're talking about getting rid of capitalism. And those aren't the same things, right? So the part of it is admitting that the tools that we have right now are imperfect. how can we leverage these imperfect tools towards a collective future, and how can we all align on where we're headed and the fact that we have different roles to play to get there, as opposed to if you're not moving towards this radical future in the same way, with the same perspective, then it's not worth a collaboration. And that's been sitting with me a lot. What are the ways that we collaborate with folks who are doing more on the ground action? What are the ways that we collaborate with folks who are in funding space or who are in research space? What are ways that we collaborate with folks who are in elected and political strategy work? Because we all have a different role to play.
Rhonda, do you see any of these spaces being created even a small scale, where they're, even though we might not even share the same vision, but just to have a bigger belief in equity, right? Like if we could just say like, we want more equity and not get bogged down in like, what does, what exactly does it mean? I'm like, we want things to be more fair for all, across all the lines of difference. Can we work together? And I'm just curious, where have you seen, just for hope, right? Hey, here's an example, maybe in present time. Technology, yeah, can we come here? Like, okay, here's
contemporary time. Okay.
Yeah, current times. Here's where I'm seeing even a small version of this, where we can point to learn or point to find inspiration.
Yeah. So the example I think of right now is Campaign for Our Shared Future, which is in this kind of watchdog space, particularly around all the issues we've been talking about for anti-CRT and anti-LGBTQ student and teacher access to public education. They have the purview of, okay, here's what's happening from a political perspective. Here's what might be happening locally on the ground. Here's how we equip educators, advocates, community leaders with more knowledge, et cetera, for how they can push back in their local communities. And there are funders who clearly are funding that work. So funders who think about, okay, what is our role in advocacy? So it's not just, yes, we're going to provide some direct funding for nonprofits who are doing this work right now, but we also have to be a part of funding this long game. And so it's funding the communications and organizing groups. It's funding the pipeline of candidates. It's funding the candidate training programs, right? Not necessarily the candidates themselves, but do we have more fertile ground for people to go and learn how to do this? And so there are definitely funders who think about their role in advocacy in that way. That's like, I can move the needle faster if I fund Vote Mama Foundation and get more progressive women to be running for elections than if I am trying to fight in every school district in our state, because they're starting to advance some of these more oppressive local policies. So I think of orgs like that are looking at this bigger picture, but I want to know, like you, like if there is a big playbook, I don't know what it is. I want someone to distill it for me so that I can see this is where we play as Beloved. This is where I might play as an individual. And this is what I can trust is happening in all of these other spaces.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, Rhonda, the work we're trying to do, I feel like we're playing in the same pot, right? Like, okay, how do we, can we add like a little life raft so that it's not so hot, right? Or can we lift someone up and I'll be hotter and you won't? But we're still in the same hot pot, right?
Right.
And I'm like, dude, we need to change something about this pot, or get out of this pot, or do something else. And it's when I look at some of the history of how things happened, change happened, and how calculated it was, and some of the incredibly ethical, I was just like, wow, that really happened. That happened, and it was orchestrated by a few pretty powerful people. If we can bring it to the people ourselves to move, we have moved in history, and we've got incredibly smart, committed people. I wonder if we can work in collaboration, coalitions, and multiracial difference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it could be this beloved community where we might not agree on everything, but at least we agree on the bigger idea that we got to get out of this hot pot, right?
Yep, yep,
And can we move forward in some way together? So
yeah.
I love that so much. Rhonda, with this, like, so many stumper questions I gave you. Thank you for your willingness to
Yeah,
use them
this
and
is
share.
great. We just need to talk more, I think. We've
So
uncovered a
good.
lot of things together.
Let's
Together.
let's move to lightning round. Are you ready?
Ooh, lightning round. Okay, sure.
Chocolate or vanilla?
Vanilla. It's so sad for my life, but yeah.
Cooking or takeout?
Cooking.
Climb a mountain or jump from a plane?
Those are my options.
Mm-hmm.
Climb a mountain.
Have you ever worn socks with sandals?
House socks with house shoes. That's only inside the house, not outside of the house.
How would you rate your karaoke skills on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being Mariah Carey.
She's 10. Okay, so 4.
What's a recent book you read?
Oh, I'm reading some Ross Gay right now, The Book of Delights.
Hmm.
Mhm.
What's your favorite way to practice self care?
Um, Dance, like by myself in a dance class, on a dance floor, any kind.
What's a good professional development you've done?
Hmm. I recently did the Heart of Black Leadership with the Rockwood Institute, and it was the first time I've had a professional development that really provided care and inspiration. Yeah.
What's your definition of a boss mama?
A boss mama, all of us really. Mamaing is hard work. Um, and I think anytime you can figure out how to keep yourself afloat, how to keep your kids afloat, um, without losing the joy, um, so that your kids get to experience this fullness of you, is a boss move.
And what advice would you give your younger self?
Hmm. My younger self was just as opinionated, but a lot quieter. And so I would just tell her it's okay. It's okay to speak up. Um, yeah.
Where can we find you? I know you have a website, so you could share
Oh,
your website and other LinkedIn and social media.
yeah, I do. So you can find me at rhondabroussard.com. And I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram. Um, yeah, I'm on those 2 places most consistently.
And last question, do you have a final ask, recommendation, or any parting thoughts to share?
I really do think that we should be learning more about our local elections, local candidates, even for races, down ballot races where you might not be thinking a lot about who your insurance commissioner is, or um, but how do we understand the people and build relationships with people who are going to be making more and more decisions that impact us.
Rhonda, thank you so much for going on this journey with me from young Rhonda to if we could be our way.
Yeah.
So appreciate you and your wisdom and stories.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And I'm serious. We should continue this conversation in other formats. It'll be great.